Hi, welcome to my channel and thank you to my subscribers. If you have not already subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. In this video, we are going to see how to get an access token from Azure AD B2C using OAuth 2 client credentials grant and then secure the APIs that are hosted in AWS API Gateway using the access tokens that are generated from Azure AD B2C. Before going into the configuration steps, I will quickly explain the end-to-end flow using this diagram. So let's say there is a client application which wants to access APIs that are hosted in the AWS API Gateway. In order to access the AWS the APIs that are hosted in the AWS API Gateway, it needs some kind of a token. So, for example, if it is a public API, then it's fine. If it doesn't contain any sensitive details, you can just host it in API Gateway and open it for public. But if it is a critical API or an API that returns sensitive data, you need to add some kind of a security layer. And API Gateway actually provides an out-of-the-box JWT Authorizer, which you can use to secure the APIs. And this JWT Authorizer can accept JWT tokens from any identity provider like Azure AD B2C. And so if you look at this diagram, the client application will first get an access token from Azure AD B2C using OAuth 2 client credentials grant. And that's what happens in the step 1 and step 2. And once it gets that JWT access token from Azure AD B2C, it can then pass that access token in the header to the APIs that are hosted in AWS API Gateway. And what AWS API Gateway will do is it will use the JWT Authorizer to validate those access tokens by getting the public key from the Azure AD B2C's JWK URI and then validate the signature of the token. If the signature is valid, it will also validate the claims within the token like the audience claim, the scopes claim, and if everything is fine, then it will call the backend API, which sits behind the AWS API Gateway to get the data and return the data back to the client. But if any of these validations fail, then it will either return an unauthorized error if the token is invalid, or a forbidden error if the token is valid but the scopes in the token doesn't allow to access that API. So I will show all these things in the demo, but at a high level, what happens is a client application will get an access token from Azure AD B2C and then pass the access token to the AWS API Gateway, which in turn will validate the tokens using the JWT Authorizer and then either allow access and return data or deny access to that client application. So you can actually download this diagram from my GitHub link. I use the draw.io website for drawing this diagram. It's open source and you can download this file and open it in the draw.io, or you can check in into your GitHub and directly open from GitHub in draw.io. I will share these links in the comment section. So let's now go to the configuration steps. So we need to do some configuration on the Azure AD B2C side as well as on the AWS API Gateway side, and then we can use Postman to test this flow. So let's first start with Azure AD B2C. So we need to configure a OAuth 2 client credentials app in Azure AD B2C. So go to Google and you can search for Azure AD B2C client credentials. And you will find this link which explains the step-by-step instructions on how to configure an application in Azure AD B2C and get the tokens using client credentials grant. So I will quickly go through these steps. You can go through this document at a later point of time. Anyway, I will also refer these documents when I am doing this setup. So first we need to register a web API app. So what it means is basically you need to create an application in Azure AD B2C which represents the API. So let's actually start with that. I will create a new app called, let's name it as User API app. Let's just name it as User API, register the app. And the next step, as per the documentation, is we need to actually set the scopes, the application scopes. So let's actually do that. Go back to this configuration, go to the app roles, and let's create two different app roles. I will name it as read user and select the applications here and name it as read colon user, read users. And I will create one more called read posts. Maybe it's just dummy APIs which I'm using for testing. So let's you can configure these scopes according to your application requirements. So read colon posts and read user posts. So I created two application roles here, and the next step that we need to do as per the documentation is set an application ID URI. So in order to do that, go back to that same application registration and then go to expose an API and then click add. So here let's replace this API colon / with, let's go to the settings and copy this one, which is our domain, and again click this add, remove this API colon / and let's add this one and slash that value. So please make sure you configure this type of a URL, otherwise you might face issues when you're trying to get the token. So now click save, and you can again see these details in the documentation as well, where they have given an example of how to configure an application ID URI. So here in the documentation, they talk about adding these app roles to through the manifest file, but I did it through the UI. And if you go to the manifest file, you can actually see the app roles that I defined using the UI pages. But you can manually modify this file as well in order to add these application roles. So we are done with the API application registration. Now we need to register the client application. So let's again go back to Azure AD app registrations. So we have the API app. Now let's actually register a API gateway client app. Let's call it as a AWS API Gateway client app. So if you look at these instructions, it says you need to actually set this particular manifest value to the number 2. So let's go back here, go to the manifest file, and if you search for that, it's here. Change it to 2 and click save. And once that is done, you need to actually create a client secret, which we can do later. Let's actually first grant this application access to the APIs that we created in the previous step. So in order to do that, let's actually go back to this screen and then go to the API permissions, and let's add a permission. Go to my APIs, and this is the API that we defined, which is user API. Click that one, select both the scopes and add permission. And here it gives that it's not granted default access. So let's actually provide default admin consent for both these scopes. So now the default admin consent is given for both these scopes. So now this client app, so what I have done is basically defined an API application in Azure AD B2C and a client application in Azure AD B2C and gave permissions for that client application to access that API application. So these are all now just configurations. We will see these things live in action when we actually configure the API app in the AWS API Gateway. So what we have done right now is just the security related configuration in Azure AD B2C. So in order to get the access token, you can see these instructions again here. So you need to build this URL, which is this tenant name, all those things, and then pass all these values in the post request body. So let's actually do that and see if we are able to get an access token. And I'm using Postman for getting the access token. So I already have a blank request here, change it to post, paste it here, and we need to replace this tenant name. So let's go back to this Azure AD B2C screen, go to settings, and we can see the tenant name as second action 101 Gmail, which is my Gmail ID. And you can leave this on Microsoft.com because it's already present here. So don't copy that one, just copy that first text, place it here, and then copy it here as well. And then it asks for a policy. So let's go back to this Azure AD B2C and scroll down, and you will see a place where you can see the policies. I think this one, user flows. Yes. So if you go to this user flows, you can see this policy and you can just copy that and paste it here. And the next thing that we need to do is you need to pass these request body parameters. So let's actually go here, go to body, change it to X form URL encoded and copy this, paste it here. And this is a constant value because we are going to get access token using OAuth to client credentials grant. So the grant type needs to be client credentials. Then we need to pass the client ID. I will come back to that value and client secret. Let's just paste the key names here and then update the values and the scope. So the first thing is client ID. So in order to get this client ID, go to that app registrations again. And if you remember, we created a AWS API Gateway client app. So go to that app, copy this application client ID, paste it here. Then we need a client secret for this client ID. So let's again go back to this same app and go to the certificates and secrets. Let's generate a new client secret. Let's name it as version 1. Copy this value, paste it here. Then we need to define the scope. Again, go back to Azure AD screen. And if you look at this scope, this is the format of the scope. So in our case, if you remember, for the API application that we configured in Azure AD, we actually configured an application ID URI. So let's go back to that Azure AD configuration, app registrations, user API. This is the one I configured. Go to expose an API, copy this value, paste it here. And then if you look at this documentation, it asks us to append /.default. So append that value and let's try hitting this URL. Yes. So looks like all the configurations were fine, and that is the reason why we are getting this access token. Otherwise, you will get some error. And then you need to again debug. So let's view this access token in JWT.io website and see what are the contents of this access token. So if you look at the key claims in this access token, it is the scope claim where we can see read:user, read:posts. These are the API scopes which I defined for that user API app. And then in the client application that I created, I actually authorized that client app to allow to access these API scopes. So that's why when I am getting an access token for that client app, I am getting both these scopes. Then you can see the audience value, which is actually a representation of that client application resource. So this is the audience value. So if you go to this user API configuration, and if you look at the client ID, it starts with D8, ends with 83. And here you can see this starts with D8 and it ends with 83. So what this actually means is the audience of this access token is the user API application, which will be hosted in AWS API Gateway and which we will see at a later point of time. So this audience value represents the user API application. And this scope represents the APIs which this client application can access. Basically, it can read a user, it can read the posts of the user. And then the issuer represents the AzureAD B2C tenant, which is my tenant. Like if I go back to this AzureAD B2C, and if I go to the overview, somewhere I should be able to see all the tenant details. It's not showing up here. Let's see here, or let's actually go to one of the user APIs. So if you look at this directory tenant ID, it starts with C174. I think it should match with this one somewhere. Yes. So it starts with C1 and 74. So this is my AzureAD B2C tenant ID. In your case, it will be a different one because it is unique across AzureAD, across all customers. So these are the main claims like the scope, the audience, and the issuer. So now we are done with the AzureAD B2C configuration for the client credentials. So what we have done until now from this diagram is step number 1 and step number 2. So now we need to go ahead and configure the AWS API Gateway application, and after that we should be able to test the steps 3, 4, 5 and 6. So now let's go to the AWS management console, go to the API Gateway service, and let's actually create a HTTP API. So please note that the JWT Authorizer is supported only with HTTP API option and not with REST API option. If you are using a REST API with AzureAD B2C token, you need to build a custom authorizer, a Lambda authorizer, which can receive the token, validate the token, and then allow or deny access. So if you want to use the out-of-the-box JWT Authorizer, then you need to select HTTP API option. So let's now build a HTTP API. Let's name it as User API. The same thing that we named here in AzureAD B2C. So let's name it as User API. Click Next. Let's configure the routes later. So click Next. Let's leave these things as is. Go to Next and create. Now let's create a couple of endpoints. Like for example, let's name it as get user and one more called get posts. So for the get user, let's actually attach an integration. What it means by an integration is basically like the API gateway endpoint that I created, the route that I created, it just says /user. So when I hit this /user endpoint, I need to get some data, right? So API gateway needs to contact some other application in the backend to get that data. And it can be anything. Like if you look at this option, it can be a Lambda function. It can be another HTTP URI from where API gateway will get the data and then return it back to the client. Or it can be an event bridge. It can be multiple things. Like you can scroll down and see. So in my case, I'm just going to use a dummy JSON data that is available in internet. So just search for JSON test data and I'm going to use this JSON placeholder fake REST API. Okay, this will just return some fake data just for testing purpose. But in your case, if you're building a real application, you might have a Lambda function which is querying some database, getting the data and returning it back to the client, or you can have some other integration like whatever I showed here, right? It can be a step function or a simple queue service or a private resource. It can be anything. So this is just for demo purpose. I'm using a publicly available test data. So if you see this value, it will return a JSON data. So I'm going to add a HTTP URI. HTTP method can be any. Just paste that URL and click create. And similarly, I'm going to create and attach an integration for /posts, same HTTP URI. If you go back here and you have a posts, your dummy data, just add that one, create. And it should have already got deployed, but because my stage is default, it should have got deployed by default. Let's actually test that. So if I go to this API, I have this URL which AWS API Gateway created by default for this particular HTTP API application. So let's copy that. Go to Postman and type /user. So why I am typing /user is because I created a route called /user. Just click send. Yes, I got that same data which we saw in that fake data website. Now if I type posts, I got the posts. So now if you look at this API, both these APIs /user/posts, there is no authorization for these two APIs. So anyone from internet can access these APIs and get the data. Now, if we want to add a security layer on top of that, we need to attach an authorizer to both these endpoints. And let's see how to do that. So now, as I mentioned, both these APIs are open to public. Now we are going to add an authorization layer on top of these two endpoints. And we are going to authorize both these APIs using the access token that is generated using AzureAD B2C. Client credentials grant. So let's first start with the user and attach an authorization. And let's create a new authorizer. And here you select JWT Authorizer. Let's name it as AzureAD B2C JWT Authorizer. And it asks for the issuer URL. So if you remember this decoded token from JWT.io, this is the AzureAD B2C token. You can see this ISS claim. Just copy that value and come back to this screen and paste it here. And then it asks for an audience value. Again, go to this same JWT.io, copy this value and paste it here. Now create and attach. So now if you see both these routes /user/post, now we have added an authorization layer for the get user API, but the get posts is still open to public, right? So let's actually check that. Now if I try to hit get user, I am getting an unauthorized error because now this API is secured using the AzureAD B2C access token. Until and unless I pass a valid access token from AzureAD B2C, I won't be able to access this particular API. Now if I try to access posts, I got the response because it is still open to public. So now let's first try to get a token from AzureAD B2C and then access this /user API. But before that, we need to do one more configuration. So if you see this configuration, I added a JWT authorizer to this user route. Now let's edit this authorizer. Sorry, not edit the authorizer. So let's add an authorization scope. So let's actually say that only client applications which has this read colon user scope can access this API. So let's add the scope as read colon user and click save. So now, if you look at this diagram, like whatever I mentioned here, what the JWT authorizer will do is it will validate the access token signature using the public key downloaded from JWT as URI, and then it will validate the audience and also the scopes. So let's actually try to get a new token from AzureAD B2C. So we got a new token, and you can again check this token details here. You can see the token details here. It has both the scopes, read colon user, read colon posts. Now let's actually pass this token to the slash user API in authorization header. So I'm just going to pass that token. I should get the access. Let's see. I don't know what is happening. Let's see. Maybe there is something wrong in the configuration. Let me check it. So, yeah, everything looks fine. There is something wrong in the configuration, or maybe it's taking some time. Oh, okay. Let me check. So the audience looks fine. The issuer URL looks fine. Yeah, everything looks good. And this one is read colon user. Let me actually confirm that. Read colon user. It should ideally work. Let's see what is happening. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it was my mistake. I should have added it as an authorization header, but instead I added it as a query param. That's the problem. Yep. Let me again copy that token from here, paste it here. Yep. I got the response now. It was my mistake. I added it as a param, which is actually a query param instead of headers. So you need to pass the authorization header with that access token, and now I got the response. Now let's do the same thing for the post API. So I will attach an authorizer for the post API. So if you see this drop down, I already have this AzureAD B2C JWT authorizer. Let's use the same thing. And for the post, if you remember, we defined a specific scope for post. So let's actually copy that read colon posts and add it here, save it here. Now if I try to access the posts API, it should give me an authorization error. So let's see that. Yes, I got unauthorized error because now the post API is also secured using AzureAD B2C Access Token. So now let's actually use the same access token which we used for the slash user, because that same access token has both the scopes, read colon user and read colon posts. And let's add it here. Yes, so we got the response. So if you look at this diagram, now we have configured the steps 3 to 6, and now we are able to get the data, and we have secured both these APIs using AWS API Gateway's out of the box JWT Authorizer. So now let's test this forbidden option. Like unauthorized happens when the token is invalid, but forbidden error is returned when a scope is not present in the access token. That is, I pass a valid access token, but the scope is not available. So let's say I'm trying to read the posts, but I don't have the read colon post scope in the access token. The access token is still valid, but the scope is not present. So API gateway will return an forbidden error and not an unauthorized error. In order to test that, let's again go back to the app registrations in Azure AD B2C. Go to the AWS API Gateway client app, API permissions, and let's actually revoke admin consent for read colon posts. So now what will happen is, if you look at this access token, I see both the scopes, read colon user, read colon posts. Now that I revoke the admin consent for read colon posts, when I try to get a new access token from Azure AD B2C, the JWT should not contain that read colon posts scope. Let's actually check that. I think it will take some time. Let's actually wait, because sometimes even if I change, right, it takes a minute to get refreshed. So let's again get a new token and see what happens. Let's see if something changes. Yes, so now if you look at the scope, I have only read colon user, but I don't have a read colon posts. So if I try to access read colon user now, I should still get a response because this access token has that scope. So I'm still getting response for the slash user API. But if I try to access the posts API, I should get a forbidden error. Yes. So if you look at the response, it's 403 forbidden. So that is because the scope validation failed. That is, the token is valid, but this client application don't have permissions to read users posts. It has permissions to read only user details. So this is how this security layer works in the API gateway along with this JWT Authorizer. And if you are building your own API application where you are using a combination of Azure AD B2C and AWS API Gateway for hosting your APIs, this is how you can control the access and add a security layer. And this involves again multiple steps, as you saw, like configuring Azure AD B2C, AWS API Gateway, and there are lots of things which can go wrong. Like I made a mistake in a test, but there are lots of things that can go wrong in the configuration steps. You can always come back and refer the videos again to check which step got missed out or where you made a mistake. But if you still can't figure out, feel free to post your questions in the comments and I will be happy to respond. And as I said in the beginning, this diagram is available in my GitHub public repo. I will share the repo details in the comments and you can download this draw.io file and you can actually open it in draw.io. Like you can save it in your local and then open that file from draw.io. Like I have already integrated my draw.io with my GitHub, so I can directly open it. So if you already have a GitHub, you can download this file from my GitHub repo, upload it to your GitHub repo and directly open it from draw.io, or save it in your local and open it in draw.io, whichever is easier for you. So this is the end-to-end configuration. I hope you like this video. Again, please subscribe if you like this video and share this video with others. Thanks for watching. Thank you.